All right, so hello, welcome. This is your lunch study break. It is Wednesday, July 14th, 2021. We're going to pick up on the conversation that we began last week, and I have some texts to study. One of the texts was suggested by our guest Madison last week, and that's comes from Tablet by Professor Shaul Magic, who's a wonderful professor of mysticism, and he has a piece in Tablet about fanaticism and magical thinking. And then I also have a text which is appropriate for the 9 days, which is the classic Talmudic text of the story of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. The rabbis of the Talmud try to figure out, how did this destruction come about? The terrible destruction that we commemorate on Saturday night for Tisha B'Av, and they give an answer, and it's a interesting and unusual answer, and it deals with the connection to fanaticism, the connection to belief, and ultimately, are we going to stand by our belief, irrespective of all consequences, or are we going to make sure that our faith comes with a little common sense? So that is really going to be what I'm going to launch into today. I'm going to, I didn't know if I wanted to start with the Tablet article or with the Gemara. Does anybody have a preference, the Tablet or the Talmud? Maybe let's start with the Tablet, and then I'll move to the Talmud as we'll go deeper as we go through the class. So I'll start with the Tablet article. Did anybody have any comments or feedback from last week's class? Did anyone want to follow up? I just wanted to provide a time for us to discuss if anybody had any follow-up around Madison's conversation last week that wanted to add any notes.
I'll just say that I emailed her about the same time that I emailed you, and she did get back to me. So if anyone wants to email her, she does respond.
All right. That's right. Okay. All right. So let's continue. And I think, one of the things that came up in the discussion and really led to this article is Madison said, she's been covering these Haredim and their use of psychedelics and alternative psychedelics or whatever they are. And she was talking about how COVID fractured this community a little bit because it provided just gave them they had to deal with a question of what were they going to believe in and how are they going to come together. And so what she provided, and I'm going to go to you, Judah, in 1 second, but what she provided us was a really interesting article, which I think is worthwhile reading, which is COVID-19, Haredi Jewry, and Magical Thinking. During quarantine, we judge the ultra-Orthodox for practicing what other Jews preach. Okay, an interesting and provocative title. So we're going to look at that a little bit. In fact, why don't I give you the link if anybody wants the link to that article. Judah, what was your question?
Not a question, but a statement. And just that I think you learned from her, Rabbi, because last week you talked about plant-based things, and she, said, no drugs. So we're not just talking about organic hippy-dippy things that grow from the earth. We're talking about things made in labs, whatever. So, it's not just Jews can do or do drugs that aren't.
Well, that was my favorite answer, Judah. My favorite answer that she gave was to a really good question, which was, why do this with a ritual committee? Why not do it scientifically if it's science? And she sort of disavowed me of my either or thinking in that question, which I really liked. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be a synergy between science and faith and religion, as opposed to viewing them as non-overlapping magisteria, which I think is our traditional fallback. She doesn't, in this generation, doesn't see it in that way. And I think that's really nice. I think that's a really
I might just add, just from
approach.
Share personal experience from somebody who's done all kinds man-made and from the earth, that the most organic trip I ever had was from magical mushrooms in Bali, which you can only eat the day that they're harvested. And they sell them in restaurants. You can either get a lassi, a milkshake, or an omelet. And it was really the most visual and audio psychedelic experience I ever had. So there's something to be said for organic psychedelics, I guess.
Wow, that sounds like quite an experience. Thank you for sharing that with us. Let's take a look. So let's take a look at the issue that we have at hand, which is how, when a lot of, I guess, some of these psychedelics, some of these healings, some of this organic, natural, non-organic can lead people to think that they are protected from illnesses, or they are protected somehow from COVID. And Shaul Magic is going to ask us to really confront what it is that we believe and how COVID has challenged us to do that. So he writes here, he quotes from Zizek, an academic conference some years ago, I heard the following joke told by the philosopher Slavoj Zizek. He says a student went to his philosopher professor's house for a visit. As he knocked on the front door, he noticed that there was a horseshoe hanging above the doorpost. When the professor answered the door, the student said, "Dear professor, why do you have a horseshoe hanging above your door? Everything you taught us would say believing in this stuff is nonsense." The professor replied, "Oh yes, I certainly do not believe any of it, but they say it works even if you don't believe." Magid writes, I thought of this joke as I read the many essays about Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jewish responses to the coronavirus. Many attempts have been made to try to understand and often criticize the Haredi community's lack of expediency in closing yeshivot and enacting social distancing and heeding medical advice. Many reasons have been given as to why this was so, some more convincing than others. Some attribute their actions to underlying beliefs in the protective character of Torah study, others to the strong focus on communal religious worship. Frequently, we find criticism, often from modern Orthodox circles, that these beliefs are so embedded in the Haredi world that they have undermined their ability to heed science, right? So he'll talk about some of these things, and they've come up. In fact, maybe people have asked me these questions, how long do I have to say the Kaddish so that the soul will, we talked about this just a few weeks ago, and we talked about that sort of thinking, and can be very comforting for some people. Others claim that Haredi's lack of scientific education made them unprepared to understand what was at stake. So a cynical attitude underlies some of these accusations, as if to suggest that Haredi Jews have somehow misinterpreted or misunderstood normative Judaism in ways that resulted in endangering their communities. But what I find more compelling as an explanation, Magid writes, is an innate distrust of civil authorities' ability to judge when a danger is so extreme that it would require mandates ceasing from religious activities. Haredim are certainly aware that danger requires avoidance and distancing. And he offers one example of Rabbi Moshe Schick, who was known as the Maharam Schick, who was one of the most venerated Haredi halakhic authorities of his generation in the 19th century. In the middle of a long responsum, he wrote, even regarding things related to the body, shaykh laguf, it is forbidden to go under an unstable bridge or a crooked wall, all the more so to do any dangerous place in regard to one's soul. As the Torah teaches, guard yourself and guard your soul. Since the law prohibits going someplace that would endanger one's body, we also find that it is prohibited to go any place where there is a danger more generally. For doesn't the Torah teach, let there be found, not be found blood in your house? Okay, so Magid writes, the Haredim, they're certainly aware of avoiding danger, but the question is more about authority. And this really is the question. Who gets to determine the risk and the danger, and who gets to dictate what activities need to cease in light of it? Certainly a relevant question today. But what has been less examined is the extent to which this dire situation exposes certain fissures in modern iterations of Judaism more generally. It makes plain what we all know, which was that many Jews who claim fidelity to normative Jewish law and practice, as rooted in the textual tradition, have also fully absorbed the Enlightenment idea that science or scientific knowledge represents the most accurate representation of reality, right? I'm sure probably we would all say that, even or especially when it conflicts with religious beliefs. Right? It is certainly true that Haredi leaders misjudged the pandemic and their constituents have paid a high price. However, the Haredim were negligent in part because they actually took seriously religious beliefs that many traditional Jews claim to hold. In other words, Magid writes, they really believe it. So the notion of covenantal reciprocity, that our actions are an answer to a divine command that will evoke divine mercy, runs down the spine of the entire tradition and the spine of our Wednesday classes, right? Certainly, that's all we've been talking. Ellen's smiling. That's all we've been talking about. It does not suggest mitzvot will always protect us, as if there's some sort of magical formula. We know that's not the case. As the sages somewhat cynically teach, there are no rewards for mitzvot in this world. That's really nice. But this equation is arguably the very operating system of Judaism. Other Jewish communities that pledge fidelity to tradition are well aware of these rabbinic precepts and this idea, but in actuality, they don't really believe them, not when confronted with scientific counter evidence. And what exactly does that say about the belief of the modern Jew? It's a good question. Now, it is certainly true that the rabbinic precepts of a life-threatening situation, pikuach nefesh, we know this, we've talked about this, nullifies all obligation, and Haredim know that as well as non-Haredim. The Haredim have heard of pikuach nefesh, Shaul Magic wants to remind us. But when exactly the pandemic met the halachically mandated pikuach nefesh is a matter about which there can be some debate. Pikuach nefesh is not a halachic category easily deployed for an entire population. Its effects are so far-reaching. In a state of pikuach nefesh, you can eat non-kosher food. You can desecrate the Shabbat. You can eat on Yom Kippur. There's the famous story, I'm sure you've heard it over the past year, of Rabbi Salanter, who founded the Musar movement, who made Kiddush in synagogue on Yom Kippur during a cholera epidemic. So certainly that is a great example. Now, there is some doubt, Magid writes, as to whether he actually made Kiddush at his shul, but that he ate in public to encourage his constituents to do so is widely acknowledged. Pikuach nefesh in the middle of an epidemic. But this reasoning is certainly not applicable to the current situation of quarantine. For the Jew who professes belief in the tradition and also in secular science, the threat of the coronavirus has helped illuminate where his emphasis lie. In a recent essay on the subject of coronavirus as a wake-up call for ultra-Orthodox Judaism, Yitz Greenberg claims that the theology of the Haredim are refuted by facts, but Magid says, how do facts refute theology or support it? He continues, the second serious misinterpretation in Haredi theology is to see sickness and natural catastrophe as divine punishment for sins rather than as natural phenomena. Of course, that theology is not exclusively Haredi, but flows through most of our tradition, including our liturgy. Greenberg also attributes Haredi inaction to a belief in magic. He says, magic claims that through certain words or actions or faiths or behavior, God is compelled to do what we want. That the Torah treats magic as abhorrent. I say this all the time in shul. We can't create a formula and have God come down and have to perform it. That would put us as in charge and would make God a little puppet that we just need the operating system. So the Torah treats that as abhorrent. This is true, but not quite what is at issue with the Haredim. When one says that Torah study protects the Jew, he is not saying that it compels God to protect them from harm. Rather, it suggests that doing God's will serves as strengthening a covenantal bond between God and Israel that merits divine protection. This supposition can be found in thousands of sources. There is nothing inherently mystical or magical about it. And Greenberg accuses the Haredi community of engaging in what he calls as magic by literally believing and acting on what the sages said about the protective nature of mitzvot. Okay, thoughts on this dynamic and this question. There's more to come here, but I just wanted to pause here for a second. So does anybody have any thoughts on what we've heard so far before I sort of sum up where we find ourselves? Judah.
I just want to share an experience I had last year. I was in a Tuesday night Torah study at somebody's home, and it was like 30 people, half Orthodox and half conservative. We were talking about magic, and I mentioned, amulets. And there was a Sephardic Mizrahi woman in the group, very Orthodox, who said, they're not magic. It's not hocus pocus. It's all, spiritual. And, we were talking about, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Saadia Gaon.
Yes, Sajid Gaon, sure.
Who, is so popular in Israel. And, you get something he touched or he made or whatever, whatever. And this is like, makes this aura of around you. And I said, it's magic. And she said, no, it's not magic. It's spiritual, whatever.
But are we free from that? I mean, are we Beth Shalomers? Are we, is it just the Haredi that have those sort of magical totems, or do we at our shul adopt them too? And we have in our community of things that we do. Can you think of anybody? Anybody have a?
Well, the mezuzah.
Well, there you go, right? We put a mezuzah up. Why do we kiss the mezuzah? Why do we put the mezuzah up?
That depends on whether you ask someone like Jonathan Seidel, whom I mentioned to the other day, or Maimonides. I mean, opinions differ.
Exactly. And that's where Magid is going with. And he's saying opinions are going to differ, but there's so much of our literature. He's saying opinions are going to differ over the magic, Judah. We're going to disagree on, do the mezuzahs have to be checked and all that. We're going to disagree of the efficacious nature of those sort of checks. But what Magid is saying is it's actually a little bit more than that, because they're just taking at face value what our tradition is teaching. And in doing so, they believe it. And their number one priority would be to the tradition. So when the rubber meets the road and the two come into conflict, well, we should pause a second, Magid wants us, before criticizing them, because they are Jews and they are reading the same text as us. So let's pause for a second. Because aren't they just believing what we share communally? Right. So let me move forward a little bit here. So,
Rabbi,
go right ahead. He's going to give examples, but go right ahead, Judah.
I don't want to speak for anybody else, but the answer is tradition. Yeah, Fiddler on the Roof. I mean, I can just speak for myself. Like a lot of what I do, whether it's kissing a mezuzah or whatever, it's because it's a minhag. And
That's
it's something that I, some I choose to do and some I don't do. But, many people.
You don't attribute a metaphysical thing to
I can't remember whether it was, what they do at Beth Sholom. But, my congregation now, they raise the pinky. I don't raise the pinky. It's not my minhag. So it's like, I don't think I'm doing a sin, or I don't think I'm,
You know what that's about? You want me to explain the pinky to you real quick?
I think I know, but I forgot, but I don't care. But yes, go ahead if you want.
So you're saying the words Vizot HaTorah means, and that's the Torah. So we're pointing, we're saying Vizot HaTorah, we're saying that's the Torah, but to point like this at someone is rude, because you're really pointing your finger in their face. So you do a soft point, Vizot HaTorah, so as not to be rude to the Torah. That's where that minhag comes from. But your point is well taken. We do these things, kiss the mezuzah, kiss the tzitzit, kiss the tefillin, whatever it is, we kiss the prayer book. I mean, I see people drop their kippot and they kiss the kippot when they pick it up. That one I think is strange. So we do these things and we believe that it has certain metaphysical or whatever, or we just do them because we saw our parents do it, we see everybody else do it, and we don't really give it that much thought. We don't actually think step on a crack, our mother's back is going to break, but nonetheless, we still don't step on the cracks. And that's the Zhishik
Rabbi. Also,
yeah.
just a little, if nobody knows this, after 40 years in San Francisco, I found out that pointing your finger at certain ethnic groups in San Francisco is taking your life in your hand.
Well, that's exactly right.
That's the most insulting thing you can do. So don't ever,
But that's right. I always tell, never point. Absolutely. It's a terrible thing to do. I teach my kids. Ellen.
But I think that these things, you can also do these things in a non-superstitious kind of way. When you recognize the Torah, it's almost like you're creating a link from that Torah into your heart. And the same with the mezuzah, that you're reminding yourself, this is the way I want to walk in the world.
And if, okay, so Ellen, we're going to have to figure out what's going to happen when that way that we want to work in the world contrasts and conflicts with the scientific perspective, which tells us how we have to walk in order to maintain our health. So he's going to go and deal with that. So consider that Jews often recite Psalms in times of distress. Is it just to calm our nerves, or do we really believe it can be in some way efficacious? If the latter, is that magic? The fact that the modern Orthodox and other Jewish communities quickly ceased from the public study of Torah, closed schools, and sheltered in place was indeed smart and correct. But the fact that there was not much consideration, there wasn't here, as far as I know, about rabbinic teaching and the efficacy of mitzvot, also, I mean, we really didn't sit and talk about whether or not the mitzvot can push back the pandemic, also says something about the ways that those communities navigate between tradition and modernity. It seems clear when science trumps religious practice, we believe science, nothing more to be said. The Haredim, on the other hand, actually believe these religious precepts and thus were slower to concede with tragic results. But perhaps we can discount the Haredi response too flippantly. What does all this say about our relationship to the tradition? And that's really my question. If this was simply about modern Jewish communities heeding their belief in science over religion, nothing here would be that new or interesting. But the story doesn't exactly end there. The complexity of modernity and Judaism and religion more generally has another layer to it. Modern traditional communities pick and choose what to believe and what not to believe. That should come as no surprise to anybody here. What to take seriously and what to discount, sometimes in ways that are far closer to magic than the belief that the Torah study protects one from harm. I'm not sure, Judah, if he's quite getting to your nuance. We pick and choose what to believe and what to take seriously and what to discount. He's saying some ways in far closer to magic, maybe magic or maybe minhag. I think there's nuance there that Judah, you're picking up on that Magid has yet to account for. I think that's a good take. But he goes on. For example, when a noted Israeli Kabbalist named Ben Tov, who claimed to be able to see one's soul root by reading one's mezuzah, visited New York in the early 2000s, dozens, even hundreds of modern Orthodox Jews lined on the Upper West Side with their mezuzahs in hand. And when a modern Orthodox couple I know had a fire in their house, the first thing they did afterwards was check their mezuzah. They wanted to see whether non-kosher mezuzot could explain their misfortune. And he says the mezuzah, whoever mentioned Maimonides, is a good example because Maimonides makes it clear how easily the mezuzah can be treated by its owner as an amulet, something that will protect us from harm. After all, one source offered for the mezuzahs is the blood on the doorposts of the Israeli homes that we put to protect us in Egypt from the plague of the firstborn. So, I mean, it has that historic reference of protecting the home. Maimonides said the sole purpose of the mezuzah should be a reminder of the divine presence. Okay, so it's a reminder of the divine presence, but it is not the divine presence protecting us. And he wants to make that distinction clear because Maimonides, that's rather important. Now, anything else borders on magic. But of course, much of later tradition, certainly influenced by Kabbalah, argues that the mezuzah does in fact have protective magical power and thus should be checked if calamity falls. It is certainly not only Haredim who believe this, right? I mean, I think that's pretty normative, this idea of checking mezuzot, right? That it doesn't even sound so strange to me, having lived in Brooklyn. In addition, how many modern Orthodox Jews traveled to receive a blessing from a Kabbalist while in Israel? Or received $1 from the Lubavitcher Rebbe, which they then saved as a charm, right? I'm sure people have seen these dollar bills next to a picture of the Rebbe on people's walls. I recall many of my friends in Israel, Magid writes, religious and secular, who had a bottle of water blessed by the famous Israeli Kabbalist Yitzhak Kadori, tucked away in their refrigerator with the label, "Do not drink." How many make the trek to the grave of the first century sage Yonatan ben Uziel in Amukah in the Galilee to pray for a soulmate, or stuff notes in the cracks in the kotel? Right, I've done that.
There are stories, Rabbi, of couples with infertility problems of checking your ketubah to see if there's actually a letter was written a little bit wrong, and then you fix the letter and there comes the baby.
Well, all right, right. So this is, this is not that strange in Jewish circles. While there is certainly nothing wrong with such behavior, it is a kind of, it can hurt Judaism, or maybe a folk Judaism. Magid says maybe these Jews don't really believe it will be efficacious, but like Zizek's professor, maybe they think it works even if you don't believe. But what if you really do believe? My point is, while the Haredim may be exemplars of what scholars of religion, Bruce Lincoln, calls religious maximalism, other traditional Jews may be exemplars of religious minimalism. Such minimalism, however, is not consistent. It includes an it can hurt unbelief, what we can perhaps call Zizek's horseshoe. If we have an ailment, we go to a doctor, and then sometimes we might get a blessing from a Kabbalist. The former is necessary, and the latter is a just-in-caseism, right? Maybe that might describe how some of us might view some of those rituals. For the Haredi Jew, however, both may be necessary, perhaps equally. Many modern traditional Jews study Talmudic passages that support the Haredi position, but when the secular world, here science, intervenes, those views quickly give way. Why? In part because they know that those teachings should not be taken literally. But then how do we determine what should be taken literally and what we shouldn't? Right? How do we decide that? Monkey asks. And so he says we should apt time to examine our religious minimalism, which he, I guess, is saying we fall into. Many of us, I think he's talking about us here, profess fidelity to a tradition that teaches us things we simply do not believe, but we are not quite ready to admit that. No, I think this group is pretty okay admitting that. But we're also okay committing to a tradition, even if it has things we don't believe. When William James asked a schoolboy in Cambridge if he knew what religion was, the boy responded, sure, believing in something you know isn't true. When science intervenes in our religious orbit, we reflexively choose science without thinking much about what that choice represents. And of course, when facing COVID-19, this was the right choice, but shouldn't it tell us a little bit about our belief, what we really believe? Was the Cambridge schoolboy correct? He quotes here Peter Berger's thesis in The Sacred Canopy on secularization and the problem of plausibility. Berger writes, put differently, secularization has resulted in a widespread collapse of the plausibility of traditional religious definitions of reality. In other words, the phenomenon called pluralism is a social structural correlate of the secularization of consciousness. Different strata of modern society have been affected by secularization differently in terms of their closeness to or distance from these processes. So he explains many of us, our religious lives, certainly in San Francisco, live and exist under the canopy of the secular. Duh. Look where we live. Come on. A view of reality that has, to some extent, undermined the plausibility of religion as the frame of how we define the world. So here I am as the rabbi trying to get us to see through this religious myth, but I am thoroughly presenting that under this canopy of the secular. As Krister Stendahl, at Harvard Divinity professor and bishop, used to tell us, religion is a very dangerous thing, especially if you believe it. And so when things are at stake, we choose science and disparage anyone who refuses or is slow to follow suit. Certainly, aren't we doing that now? Certainly we are. Anybody have any comments? Anybody want to come in here? I can keep going. Anybody want to pause and add some thoughts in there? Yeah, go, Marv. I'm interested to hear what you have to think about this here.
I try to make life simple. When I look at a mezuzah, what I see is I see freedom, because it tells me that when I was in Egypt, I was a slave and I did not have free will. So what I find is that Judaism took me out of slavery and it gave me free will to do what's right and just. So in a simple way of thinking, I take out of the religion, since it's extended to me, freedom of thought, I take out of it what I feel given the totality of my life experience as I go through time, what's going to work for me, assuming that I'm basically a decent guy. And I'm quite secular, of course, in my upbringing. So I don't have a place in my existence to know what the Haredi system is. I do read the Torah, and I know, I guess
I guess it says if you do this, you're not going to get the illnesses of the non-Jews. So it says that in the Torah. So these people believe that. And Shaul Magic is saying, well, they believe it. And we criticize them for believing it. So what does that say about us?
Well, I'm an individual in a collective. So I have my own, I can divorce myself from what the other people in the collective think if I think differently. I'm not just an ant running around in a colony. I have my own mind. So
I love your image of the mezuzah as it's almost like a portal to freedom. I often refer to our tradition and our sanctuary as, it's a space apart. It's a space apart from the secular world where we can have a Shabbat 6 days of the week. We'll be in the world, but we can have a Shabbat. We can have the sacred space apart from it. And the mezuzah, that's the freedom given to me by God, the freedom to have an alternative authority, an alternative space, the freedom not to think like everyone else. But what the Haredim say is, well, that comes with what you have to think. And Marv, you're pushing back against that. And you're saying, no, it's freedom that you're giving me here. That is the blessing. And now let me use that freedom instead of taking it away from me at the outset. That's how I hear you, or at least that's how I'm going to hear you. Jeff.
Yes.
I'm sorry you caught me off guard.
That's right.
I'd be interested in your take on the modern Orthodox, on everything that Shaul described the modern Orthodox doing. To me, it represents something I've been barking about for many years, the Haredization of modern Orthodoxy. I maintain there really is no more modern Orthodoxy. It's dead. The Haredim killed it, and the modern Orthodox helped them by digging the grave.
Yeah, I don't know. There is not a robust modern Orthodox community in San Francisco. That much I do know. No, certainly in New York. I think a lot of modern Orthodoxy came out of conservative Judaism.
Yeah.
And
I look at guys like
got roped in. I think you get roped in. Somebody told me this story. Someone who's converting to Judaism. Oh man, told me this story about a partner took them to stay at a friend's house because the partner wanted her to get used to just see what a Shabbat was. And the Shabbat was, this is such a bad story. The Shabbat, but it was a very frum Orthodox Shabbat. And the non-Jewish woman was there and eating dinner. And one of the hosts kept saying, boy, it's really cold in here. I wish there was some more heat. Really wish there was some more. Anyone know what he was doing there? Anyone? No. What he was doing, he was trying to hopefully get the non-Jewish person to turn on the heater.
Yeah.
And she hated it. She's like, this is not a faith I want to convert into.
Right.
Because that's just repulsive. And what is that about? And so, Jeff, I can't speak authoritatively, but to the extent that modern Orthodoxy moved in that direction and into the accepting of mezuzot checks, I think it has fallen prey. But I think a lot of things have fallen prey to fanaticism these days. Ben.
Yeah, I don't buy this entirely.
The whole Magid's whole point, standing up for
I don't understand what this. I think minimalism is kind of brought out as almost a slur.
Clearly.
And I don't think that's fair. I think we have, for the last, I don't know, several hundred years, accepted the fact that there are certain claims that religion's just not going to help us with, right? There are just claims about the world that it's just, right? We're not going to find any help there, right? So claims about the, efficacy of the vaccine, we're not going to get that from the Torah, no matter how hard you look. However, there are claims that the epidemiologists cannot make that, our tradition can, right? When you are running a hospital and you are overrun with COVID cases, and you have to make decisions about who you treat and who you don't treat, right? And how you triage and how you value certain people or not, your epidemiologists are not going to be able to help you there, right? But there are, the Torah might potentially. So and I've talked to you about this before, Rabbi. I think this is a false dichotomy.
All right, so I'm going to zoom ahead because he's going to address you right here. So he says here, many of us look at the Haredim as quaint, naive, uninformed, but uninformed about what? That Torah study will not protect them, as the sages teach, Ben? That mitzvot yield reward, as the Torah teaches, produce fruit in its season? Traditional Jews recite that twice daily in the Shema. Are they guilty of magic because they believe these things? Hardly. They may be guilty of religious maximalism and a failure to be adequately discerning in such matters, but that is different. Many modern Jews live, Ben, as if we have resolved the paradox of religion in modernity. We have found the great synthesis, the secret formula that enables us to be both religious and modern. Magid says this is a ruse. That paradox is never solved and cannot be solved. We are often forced to choose, and when forced to choose, we mostly choose science. Why? Because it works. Because we believe in it more than we believe in tradition. Here is where we part from the Haredim. They also believe in science to some degree. They seek medical treatment when necessary, but they believe in tradition more. And so when science dictates behavior that curtails tradition, they are slower to respond. All right, so here's the end. We can resort to the model of Maimonides, who offered a rational Judaism, and that's fine, but Maimonides' view of the rational is not ours. We live under the canopy of modern secularization. And besides, many of us also do many things Maimonides would find abhorrent, like checking mezuzot if things aren't going well, or waiting for a Kabbalist to tell us the secrets of our soul and how to heal our ailing grandmother. Modern traditionalism is not Maimonidean. It is a strange and often contradictory mixture of rabbinic teachings, Maimonides, Kabbalah, folkways, and secularism. Sounds like our shul. The Haredim are believers in ways that we are not. In this case, it killed many of them. But whether we or they are living in closer fidelity to tradition remains to be seen. We believe less, and here that helped us to survive. But as much as it is worth chastising their maximalist belief, it is worth contemplating our lack of it. Do you want to contemplate our lack of it, Ben?
I don't think he's making his point very well here, frankly. I mean, if you're talking about religious maximalism and minimalism, I think you can also talk about secular maximalism and minimalism, right? Like going to the doctor when you're sick, right? And just accepting kind of scientific claims. I think that's fairly minimalist, frankly. But I do think there's a secular maximalism, which tells us that essentially all of our ideas about ourselves and our values can be answered through essentially a secular culture. He talks about how religious maximalism has failed the Haredi in some ways, right? It led to death. I think he sells himself short in not talking about how secular maximalism fails us.
Yeah.
Right? Because I think there's
good counterattack.
something. It's not. I'm not attacking him. I'm saying he could have made a stronger point, right? He focuses on how religion fails people. But I think there are many ways in which our secular worldview fails us as well, and doesn't really talk about that.
Amen. Amen. Is anybody else? Anybody else? Yeah, go, Don. I'm curious to hear what you think.
I just have a question. So the Haredis who followed their belief, and many of them died. Okay, what do the leaders, those that stayed alive, what do they say about that? So a lot of their people died they loved and had to be horrific for them. What do they say now? Well, what's their personal response to it, to their choice?
I don't know. But I'm putting myself in their shoes for a second. Like if we hadn't closed and something like that happened here, and I said, oh, we have to stay open because having services heal people, and then people died. I was just trying to put myself in the shoe of that rabbi there for a second, Don. I would be silent and speechless, and they do say, so yeah, that's true. I got a note here. What they say is, blessed is the one true judge, Baruch Dayan Ha'amet. That's right. I mean, I hope they would do some teshuvah. That's what I would go to, Don. I would go directly to teshuvah and have to begin to counter my whatever theology drove me to that. You'd have to evaluate it. And maybe that's not something that is being done. I don't know. I'm not in that community, so I can't speak. Jeff, did you want to say something?
No, and they just, you can't put yourself in, you wouldn't think in those terms, and you wouldn't make it
hard, yeah,
on those criteria. They probably explain it in terms of sanctification of the name, those who died.
Oh, like a vault.
They would probably explain it. I mean, you're talking about a subculture when one of their rabbis, who is over 100, starts to fail. They all lose their minds and they start to, they round-the-clock prayer vigils, may he live to be 120. They're operating at a primitive level of cognitive development. They're adult children.
Well, okay, so there's some value judgments there that I don't want to associate myself with.
That's okay.
That's all right. For them, a lot of people find it very meaningful and very beautiful, and they live a life of great meaning inside of those very different ways of thinking than I think. I don't want to give any value judgments on them, just like I don't want them doing it on me. They see a world a different place, and I'm content with them living their life, and they should be content with me living mine. What I want to go to is I want to take us right to Tisha B'Av, because I think this is interestingly right on point, and hopefully will illustrate the question here. And we'll see if it does or if it doesn't. So the question is, why did the second temple was destroyed? What happened? Right? We need a reason. Obviously, the Greeks aren't stronger than we are, right? We've got it our side. So what happened here? Right? Apropos, or was it the Romans? Sorry. Apropos the war that led to the destruction of the second temple, the Gemara examines several aspects of the destruction of the temple. So Rabbi Yochanan says, what is the meaning of which it is written in Proverbs? Interesting. We can discuss why he decided to throw this in there. Happy is the man who fears always, but who hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. Happy is the man who fears always. We've been talking a lot about fear, but he who hardens his heart shall fall into mischief. So we should be constantly fearful. I think they mean fear of heaven, fear of God, but we should not, in the midst of that fear, have a hardened heart. Okay, so give us an illustration, one of the most famous illustrations in the Talmud. Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. This is the Tisha B'Av narrative. The place known as the King's Mountain was destroyed on account of a rooster and a hen, and the city of Beitar was destroyed on account of a shaft from a chariot, right? So they're small little actions that can result in the tipping point occurring. So here the Gemara explains, Jerusalem was destroyed on account of Kamtza and Bar Kamtza. So what Kamtza is, it's a nothing. Kamtza. What is this Kamtza? It's a nothing. It's a trifle, a Kamtza. And a bar Kamtza is the son of a Kamtza, which is the son of a trifle. So if a trifle is a trifle, what's the son of a trifle? Less than a trifle. So that's their name. This is as there was a certain man whose friend was named Kamtza and whose enemy was named Bar Kamtza. So we have this man, he's got a friend named Kamtza, an enemy named Kamtza, and he has a large feast and says to his servant, go bring me my friend Kamtza. Obviously, clerical work wasn't so great back then, so the servant made a mistake and instead invited the enemy Bar Kamtza. Now the man who was hosting the feast came and found Bar Kamtza sitting at the feast, and the host said to Bar Kamtza, that man is the enemy of that man, that is, you are my enemy. So what then do you want here? Arise and leave. So basically the host said to Bar Kamtza, get out of here. Bar Kamtza says, look, I'm already here. Let me stay. I'll give you money for whatever I eat and drink. Just don't embarrass me by kicking me out. The host said, no, you must leave. Bar Kamtza said to him, I'll give you money for half the feast. Just do not send me away. The host said to him, no, you must leave. He said, I'll pay for the whole shindig. Just let me stay. The host says, no, you must leave. Finally, the host took Bar Kamtza by his hand, stood him up, and threw him out. After having been cast out for the feast, so catch this. Watch what happens next. So we love that part of the story, but watch what happens next because it goes to the heart of what do we do when these two, magical thinking or theological thinking, come into conflict with real politics or real science. After having been cast out from the feast, Bar Kamtza says to himself, since the sages were sitting there, they didn't protest, and they saw how I was humiliated, learned from it that they were content. They agreed with what happened there. And therefore, Bar Kamtza says, I will therefore go and inform against them to the king. I'm going to go be a rat, a snitch. So he went and he said to the emperor, you know, the Jews have rebelled against you. So here's a guy, he's upset at the rabbis, and he goes to the emperor to spread a lie and say the Jews have rebelled, to cause strife for the Jews. Says the Jews have rebelled against you. The emperor said to him, who says that this is the case? Bar Kamtza said to him, go and test them. Send them an offering to be brought in honor of the government and see if they will sacrifice it. Great, great. The government is making an offering and see if they will accept it. So the emperor went and sent with him a choice 3-year-old calf, perfect 3-year-old calf. And of course, we know the temple certainly can accept offerings, free will offerings from anybody who wants to bring them. So now, while Bar Kamtza was coming with the calf to the temple, he very nefariously made a blemish on the calf's upper lip. So what that means is you can't sacrifice a blemished animal. So the emperor gave an animal without blemish, and Kamtza, who is sort of fomenting all of this strife, cuts the lip of the calf. Some say he made the blemish on the eyelids. Nonetheless, there was a blemish. Therefore, when Bar Kamtza brought the animal to the temple, the priests would not sacrifice it on the altar since it was blemished. But they could also not explain this satisfactorily to the Gentile authorities who did not consider it to be blemished. Okay, so let's discuss this really quickly. You are now the high priests. You are responsible for taking this offering. Your city is, I guess, precariously living under this canopy of Roman secularism. And you, this guy really mistreated. He was, I don't know, whatever you make of Bar Kamtza. I don't know. He's an interesting character. He was kicked out, humiliated, and then he retaliated. So you feel bad for him, and then he's really nefarious at the same point, but he's totally nefarious, and he's causing this conflict because what's going to happen? Well, if the temple rejects the offering, then his rumor is true. And the emperor is then going to destroy the city of Jerusalem. But if they accept the offering with the blemish, which would be halachically and by God impermissible, then they could avoid being sacked. So I usually around this time of year, I like to ask congregants to be the high priest. What do? You've lived a whole life and you know you can't eat a pork chop. You just can't eat a pork chop. We know we can't eat a pork chop, but they presented you with a pork chop. If you just eat the pork chop, everything's going to be fine. What do? You sacrifice the animal, sweep it under the rug, or do you send it back? Judah.
I was in a group studying that this week from a Musar perspective and they blame, not they, but it is blamed the destruction of Jerusalem on the high priest. And because his anava was out of balance. So, I mean, it was like on his shoulders that it was his responsibility.
So your Torah study group thought that the high priest should have eaten the pork chop.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's like his humility was too much in not making a decree. I mean, he didn't step up. He was like, you can either have too much or too little if your humility is out of balance. So here he was, the high priest, and he was saying, I can't do anything when actually he could.
Let me show the next line to put that in context for people. The blemish notwithstanding, the sages thought to sacrifice the animal as an offering due to the imperative to maintain peace with the government. Clearly, someone was thinking there. Rabbi Zechariah said to them, if the priests do that, people will say that the blemished animals may be sacrificed as offerings on the altar. The sages said, but if we do not sacrifice it, then we must prevent Bar Kamtza from reporting this to the emperor. The sages thought to kill him so that he would not go and speak against them. But they said, if you kill him, people will say that one who makes a blemish on sacrificed animals should be killed. As a result, they did nothing. Bar Kamtza's slander was accepted by the Roman authorities, and consequently, Jerusalem was sacked. And here Rabbi Yochanan says, the excessive humility of Reb Zechariah ben Avakalus destroyed our temple, burned our sanctuary, and exiled from our land because he felt he could do nothing in that circumstance. He felt his hands were tied. He felt, oh, who am I? I cannot do this, when really it was him who had been called upon in that moment. Other thoughts here? Other thoughts? Jeff?
Yeah, don't entertain and don't listen to sages.
All right. Laurel, Ellen, Lisa.
Well, we studied this morning in another group that I'm in, and
You guys, this group, nonstop Torah study. I love it. Round the clock.
a friend of mine came up with this beautiful thought that it didn't have to be either or, that the high priest could have gone back to the ruler and said, we know you sent us a perfect, unblemished animal, but something must have happened on its way to get to us. And we really appreciate your sending it.
Yeah, hearing that solution makes me think killing Bar Kamtza is not such a bad idea. Marv.
Would the Goyim know the difference between sacrifice and slaughter? Could the priest have just taken the animal?
Too many people are watching. I think basically, like, because every permutation they said, well, people will think this. I think you just have to. This whole thing is in full public view. It's an offering sent. That's my understanding. Sent in full public view, and everyone's going to watch it, and everyone's going to see how it goes down, and everyone's going to see if it's blemished or not. Don?
Yeah, I think this was said, but to eat the pork chop, there's eating the pork chop physically, but if you eat a pork chop physically, it doesn't mean you have to eat the pork chop mentally or spiritually.
And when did we say you can eat pork chop at the beginning of this class? Look at this. I was able to take this full circle. When did we say you can eat pork chop? When there's a case of pikuach nefesh. Shaul Magic. He began by saying, if there's pikuach nefesh, you can eat the pork chop. And so the high priest here was humble in his failure to declare pikuach nefesh. And I think what Magid doesn't account for is the lack of humility perhaps on the Haredim. And you could perhaps levy that same thing. They could have had a little bit more humility in that approach, but I can't judge any other rabbi in any other community. So I shudder to even judge anyone else. Marv?
You have that great saying at the end of Nitzavim. I put before you life and death, blessing and curse. Choose life. Where does that stand on the order of mitzvot? Does that stand at the top of the order? I mean, if to save a life is the highest order in Judaism, you can rationalize a lot of actions by saying this is what takes preference.
Well, yeah. And so that's a slippery slope. If, look, there were a lot of things done by a lot of communities for pikuach nefesh that we didn't do. And certain communities felt that they had to do those things and violate certain halakha, and violate certain norms because of pikuach nefesh, and so every community had to determine their own value for what the risk was in the context of that community. And, we decided to shut down very early, very quickly, and very harshly because that was the determination made by our task force that we put together, because pikuach nefesh was primary. There are 3 instances, Marv, in which we don't rely on pikuach nefesh, and I think that's a worthwhile
idolatry, murder. Yeah, idolatry, murder, and sexual immorality.
Adultery, murder, and sexual immorality. That's right. And I think what I'd like to do maybe in 2 weeks, unless someone else would like to talk about things other than idolatry and sexual immorality and murder. But if those sound like good topics for everyone here, I think I'd like to get into that because I do think that that's the next level here, which in one of those, what are the 3 circumstances in which pikuach nefesh does not apply? But I'm actually, I wasn't sure if these 2 would go together, but they really do nicely show that the rabbis need to have a great deal of humility. And that humility has to come in the face of overwhelming evidence. And so just like the high priest should have perhaps eaten that pork chop and said, I'm not enjoying this, I'm not intaking this, I'm doing this purely for the sake of saving my people. I mean, I don't know how many of us would really have a problem with that. And so maybe his inability to do that is a valid criticism given by the Talmud and the rabbis. All right, so we're about at 1 o'clock. Good discussion. Interesting to see how this all plays out. And I look forward to, my in-laws are here next week. But this Saturday night is Tisha B'Av. So if any of you want to join us, we are going to be outside. Bring warm clothing, bring a flashlight, bring your phone to read the Book of Lamentations on, but we'll also be providing books. And we'll be at 9 o'clock. It'll be dark out and it'll be mournful. And we're going to read the Book of Eicha outside this coming Saturday night. So if you're able, I hope you join us. If you're not able, we'll be online at 8 a.m. Sunday morning. Reciting the Book of Eicha as well online for those who can't be with us in person Saturday night. I wish all of you an easy fast this upcoming Tisha B'Av, and don't be fanatical about it, as I always like to say. All right, take care, everybody. Have a good day.